everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I've actually just joined the center as a visiting scholar. And I'm really excited to be here today because of that, to be able to share some of my research with you. But I've also been pretty fascinated just to see what all of you guys have been up to. So I just thank you for sharing your research with me. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump right into it. And I want to begin this talk with a very simple statement. Social networks matter. Right? The interactions that we experience with our friends, family, and colleagues essentially influence our exposure to ideas, information, and also resources, which can influence our attitudes and beliefs. Perhaps most importantly, social networks have been shown to have a profound influence on our behavior, and they can also shape our opportunities for action. This is precisely why they're so intimately tied to the theory of social capital, right? Which captures this idea that the social bonds that we form with others essentially help to build trust and reciprocity and shared norms and values, which can be valuable for both individuals and communities. One thing we might all be familiar with is the idea that social capital can help to facilitate collective action among communities toward effective resource management. At the individual level, social capital can also be considerably important for influencing outcomes. In this case, it's typically measured with social system structural traits, such as how well connected or prominent you might be in a network, or whether or not you bridge or broker between diverse social groups. Right now, being prominent in a network or having lots of friends can be beneficial because it affords you a sense of power and prestige. And if you need something, chances are one of your friends has it. Now, on the other hand, if you're bridging or brokering between diverse social groups, you're able to access diverse sources of information and also resources as well. And you can essentially bring divergent groups of actors together behind a common goal. So taken together, this implies that the distribution of social capital among individuals and environmental systems can influence things like who is more productive at extracting ecological resources, but also who emerges as influential in guiding their management. Now, in marine fisheries, and particularly pelagic marine fisheries, which is where I've been doing a lot of my work, social networks and social capital can be considerably important, right? Pelagic fishers operate really far offshore in a very dynamic, complex environment. Now, I think this picture might be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but I think it does also work to capture this dynamic, complex environment. Now, to handle this complexity, fishers not only learn from their past experiences, but they also rely heavily on sharing information within their social networks in order to mitigate uncertainty and enhance their decision-making. Yet, these are competitive environments, right? So we actually know very little about who decides to cooperate by sharing information. And we know also very little about how these cooperative networks might scale up to influence outcomes. So to explore these dynamics, I spent a combined 18 months in the field with Hawaii's longline fishermen, collecting both social network data and detailed socioeconomic data. Hawaii's longline fishery is a multi-million-dollar commercial pelagic fishery. It's the most important commercial fishery sector in the Hawaiian Islands. They target predominantly tuna and swordfish. It operates year-round under a total allowable catch, so it's quite competitive. Though Hawaii has a very diverse multicultural background, the fishery is actually comprised of only 3 distinct ethnic groups. There's a group of Vietnamese American fishermen, a group of European American fishermen, and a group of Korean American fishermen. And I'm going to be using these abbreviations that you see there throughout the rest of this talk, so please take note of them. Now, when I was talking to fishermen, I specifically asked them to identify who they shared useful information with about fishing that they felt was valuable for their success in the fishery. I also asked them to think about different types of actors that they interacted with rather than just other fishermen. I was really, really fortunate to get a very high response rate. In fact, almost every single fisherman operating in this fishery participated in this project, which essentially gave me a very rich, detailed data set that enabled me to ask lots of interesting and novel questions. Today, I'm going to focus on 2, specifically looking at how fishers' information sharing networks influence environmental outcomes, here looking at rates of bycatch as an example, and economic outcomes, here looking at fisher productivity as an example. So what's the significance of bycatch in marine fisheries? Although many of us may be familiar with it, for those of you who aren't, especially in longline fisheries, it involves placing thousands of baited hooks across vast portions of the water column, in this case up to 45 nautical miles. So though the hooks are intended to catch a particular target, in this case tuna or swordfish, they also catch lots of other things incidentally, right? Such as sharks. In this case, they can catch up to 100 sharks on a single fishing set. Now this is a significant ecological issue, as many species of shark are in decline globally. But it's also an economic problem, because in Hawaii, sharks are generally unmarketable, right? So fishermen don't really want to catch them. It's a waste of energy and time. They can lose their gear. They risk injury to the captain or crew. And on top of that, increasing concern over bycatch is essentially really pushing a lot of regulation in fisheries as well, which can have adverse economic impacts on fishing communities also. So assuming then that fishers, in this case, have an incentive to avoid shark bycatch, do they potentially utilize their information sharing networks to do so? Well, let's take a look at the network. Let me explain what you're looking at here, because it can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, I think, when you first see a network graph. So all of the shapes or nodes in the graph are individuals. So they're either a fisherman that I talked to or someone that they identified as important for information sharing. And the ties between them represent their information sharing ties, the lines. Now each node is shaped to represent different types of actors, and they're also color-coded by ethnicity. So just simply knowing that, taking a quick glance at the graph, the one thing that you might notice immediately is that fishermen tend to kind of primarily interact within their ethnic group, right? Essentially, this is what we call a network homophily effect, which captures this idea that people tend to disproportionately form ties with others that are more similar to themselves, right? It's just the idea that birds of a feather flock together. Now, there's a substantial amount of theoretical work, especially recently, that's been arguing that strong homophily effects like this in networks are likely to have significant implications for social and economic outcomes, because it creates these fault lines in the network, right, that can inhibit the flow and the diffusion of different information and resources between groups. Now, I sought to test this empirically by looking at shark bycatch. To do this, I linked my social network data with detailed fisheries observer data over a period of 5 years. And I looked at a series of negative binomial regression models, testing whether or not there were any significant differences, essentially, among these three network groups in shark bycatch. I'm not going to get into all of the modeling today, because what I really want to focus on is what I found. I would be happy to take questions about it, though, later, of course. So what I found was that there was a significant difference in shark bycatch among the three network groups. Now, as you can see here, it looks as if the European American network and the Korean American network both have similar rates per 1,000 hooks, which are listed there. Actually, when you control for all the other factors that we know affect shark bycatch, like fishing location, vessel size, or seasonality, it turns out that actually the Vietnamese American network and the Korean American network both had significantly higher rates of shark bycatch, which indicates that this network homophily effect is indeed affiliated with these fishing behaviors. However, there is one problem here, and that's the fact that this homophily effect in this case is largely driven by ethnicity. So is it perhaps possible then that what I've captured is actually a cultural effect, right? So perhaps it's a cultural norm that's influencing fishing behaviors regardless of who's talking to who. Well, there are these few individuals in the wrong network, so to speak, right? So they have a majority of ties outside their network. So are they acting more like their ethnic group or more like their network group? If they're acting more like their ethnic group, it would suggest that what I've captured is potentially a cultural effect. But if they're acting more like their network group, it would provide much stronger evidence for an explicit network effect, right? The effect of individuals actually utilizing these ties to mitigate shark bycatch. Now, when I looked at their rates of shark bycatch of these particular individuals, I found that for those that had a majority of ties outside their ethnic group, they had significantly different rates of shark bycatch than their ethnic group, but not significantly different rates than their network group. In other words, these outliers, so to speak, are acting much more like their network rather than their ethnic group, providing much stronger, essentially, evidence that social affiliations are indeed related to fishing behaviors that can scale up to have an impact on environment. Now, what impact exactly are we talking about? This is important, I think, to kind of put this in context. Again, what I have found is that one information sharing network group is catching significantly less sharks, and they've maintained this over a period of 5 years. Now, this is significant because we estimate that if everyone had the same bycatch rate as them over this period that I studied, over 46,000 sharks might not have been caught, essentially resulting in a 12% reduction in overall shark bycatch. Now, if I still haven't convinced you that social networks matter, I'm going to briefly show you how I also found them to play a role on economic outcomes. To look at this, I estimated a very simple fishery production function, essentially including social capital as an additional input. Now, controlling for the other factors of production and individual and vessel-specific characteristics, I found that network prominence, which is again how well connected you are, had a significantly positive relationship with fisheries revenue. So in other words, the more friends you have in your local network, the more money you're making. Now, on the other hand, I found that bridging or brokering between diverse social groups or across ethnic groups had a significant negative effect on fisheries revenue. So in other words, if you're interacting across social divides or with the other guys, so to speak, you're making significantly less money. Now, this is actually in clear contrast to the dominant theory of brokerage that's pervasive in the management, organizational, and economic sciences, which clearly argues that brokerage, and particularly this kind of brokerage, should have benefits, and especially economic benefits. Yet in sociology, there's an emerging theory on the fragile nature of brokerage, which captures the idea that brokers essentially have a foot in two social worlds, right? Each with their own expectations of normative behavior. And that can actually constrain actors in particular settings. And I expect that's actually exactly what's happening in this case. So what does all this mean for fisheries management? Well, again, first kind of revisiting the results here, I found that strong social divides appear to inhibit the flow of information and the diffusion of sustainable behaviors. So the management implication might seem pretty simple in this case, right? Why don't we essentially try to find a way to increase cooperation so that way we can bring everyone's bycatch rates down? Now, if this idea that increasing cooperation can benefit us sounds familiar, it's because it is. There's heaps of literature all over the place talking about how increased cooperation and collaboration can help us to essentially solve all sorts of environmental problems. Taking this a step further, more recently, there's been explicit calls for network interventions, where the goal is to actually manipulate or weave stakeholder networks into a structure that is, in theory, able to promote better outcomes. So why don't we just weave fishers' networks then, right? That sounds like it might be easier than coming up with really strict management that's going to cost a lot of money to enforce and maybe more effective as well than trying to come up with new technologies. Well, again, the problem in this case is that I found that interacting across social divides currently entails an economic penalty for individual fishers. And what do fishers care about? Profits, right? In this case, this is a commercial fishery. So if there's a cost to cooperation, trying to get these fishermen to interact across social divides is likely going to be pretty problematic. Now, to drive this point home, I want to use everyone here as an example. There was recently a paper that got published in PNAS that identified the fact that long-term, frequent collaborations, particularly between young and old scholars, can essentially have a significant positive benefit on scientists' careers, or it can essentially make them more productive. So with this information, what if our enlightened center director decided to weave your networks? And for all the postdocs, assigned you 10 grumpy silverbacks to collaborate with over the next year. And for all the distinguished, assigned you 10 naive budding scholars. And don't get too excited, they're not there to work for you, but rather with you. And they've got lots of opinions about how to do things. Now, I'm sure that all of us could identify pretty clearly the costs that would be associated with these sort of forced or manipulated collaborations, right? In terms of time, effort, potentially headaches, and so can fishers. So although network weaving may sound good in theory, and in some cases it may actually be good, we need to understand that people may not always be amenable to these sorts of initiatives, and with good reason, right? Because there's a cost to cooperation. And essentially, if we are going to have to incur that cost, we're going to have to realize the fact that what's good for the system is not necessarily always good for the individual. And I thank you very much.